Inspiring Streetscapes. My name is Abigail McCachran. I'm the practice leader and senior architect at Architecture 49 here in Halifax. I lead the mixed-use residential development studio, and I have a background. My background includes practicing architecture in Canada and the United States, heritage preservation, as well as working in construction and development. Our team is working on numerous projects around Halifax right now, and some of them you may know or have heard of. It includes the Green Lantern, restoration and redevelopment on Barrington, and the former Ben's Bakery site, as well as many more. I'm going to be calling on 4 of our speakers to come and talk about their experiences in their field. But before that, I'd like to mention again the sponsors for this conference and thank them for all of their support. And I would also like Karash to stand up. I'd like to thank him. He said thank you to everybody else that helped organize this, but he pulled this together, they all pulled this together in a very short amount of time, and I think he deserves a round of applause as well. This panel will include Hans Eiglings, and he'll be discussing Rise and Sprawl, the condominiumization of Toronto. David Wex, who will be presenting Design Forward Condominium Developments, discussing how urban capital works to support good design. Tyke Tykeson will be speaking again, and he will be talking about the architecture of Malmo and his role in changing the landscape of Malmo. Vincent Vandenberg will be speaking on behalf of local architects and his firm Breakhouse. And he will be discussing the work Breakhouse is doing to improve our city experience. Please welcome our speakers.
Thank you very much again. Good to be back behind the microphone. Now I'm speaking about a recent project together with Partisans Architects called Rise and Sprawl, which is the title of a book which we edited, compiled, and which I published as the Architecture Observer. It grew out of my fascination with how Toronto is developing and how it has changed. My first visit was in 1992 when it was, without being too negative, kind of a sleepy place compared to what it is now. And now, when I came back in 2012, when I started to live in Montreal and started to teach in Toronto, I was just fascinated by this kind of super thriving, dynamic city, which I think is really great. The other thing that really struck me is this enormous amount of buildings which quite look alike. They have a kind of similar external expression, and I started to look at them almost as an anthropologist, trying to observe how this tribe of Torontonians was living in this downtown area in those condo towers. And we published this book, which is, in a way, it's quite critical about this development, and it addresses the paradox that I think Toronto is a great city now, much greater than it ever was, but at the same time, it has achieved this without great architecture or with a lot of great quality in its public space, which I think is fascinating, especially for me with this European perspective where design is so obviously present everywhere that you can have this great city without great design. As an anthropologist, as I was trying to be there, Anthropologists are always interested in, let's say, vernacular cultures. And there's this understanding of vernacular architecture as architecture without architects. And it struck me that in Toronto it was almost the opposite. There's architecture, there are architects, but there's no architecture. So the result, it seems that architecture plays a very limited role in the, let's say, emergence or creation of those condo towers. So what we did, together with partisans, is trying to understand the logic of the condo tower. So we've been looking at, this is a bit, hope you can see it, but we've been looking at the, let's say, morphology, the form of those towers, how they emerge out of their podiums, how they are structured. And then we started to look at floor plans. So we've collected floor plans from many different projects and tried to compare them. So we looked at what we call zero bedroom units. They're never called zero bedroom unit, of course, but they are. So, and here you see how small those units actually can be, which is fascinating in itself. And then you see this gradual evolution to larger and larger ones. And for anybody with some sort of knowledge about, let's say, more than 100 years of design of housing, with this kind of minimal houses from the 1920s and 30s to all those beautiful social housing projects everywhere in the world, it's striking to see that none of the lessons that could be learned from those housing projects are actually applied here. They become bigger, but not necessarily anything else than bigger. It's a bit like, there was a Dutch architect who had a definition of bad architecture, saying the only thing that changes if you approach it, it's becoming bigger. It's not adding any additional quality. And then, this is my favorite page from the book, where you see the leftover spaces where they still were able to make an extra unit. And as you can see, this is not necessarily the most efficient form of planning. There's one, the top row, second from the right, where you see this big column, which is actually obstructing the view of one person's seat to the television. We looked at the way those condo towers were marketed, because it seems that the financial considerations are important, and the marketing and everything in between is of minor interest in this project. And I think it's fascinating to see what kind of visual language is used to present those towers, which are usually shown in isolation, which they are not. There is this kind of, well, deliberately fictional representation of what a tower could become. There's also a very interesting story to tell about the presentation of the shared facilities within those buildings. And even if you cannot really see it from a distance, one striking thing is that there's this kind of homogeneous atmosphere of a kind of outdoor nightlife atmosphere which moves into your condo building. And then the most striking part, perhaps, is the exterior color of towers. We've looked at a number of towers and tried to see what are the prevalent colors. And you can see there's one very exciting one with a bit of red and one with a bit of green, but otherwise they're all in the same palette, which I think is fascinating to notice. And it's really striking to me as a sign of this sameness and perhaps also a certain blandness of those towers. So it's really puzzling and intriguing to me what's happening with those towers in the city, which is so exciting, but the architecture is quite the opposite. And the other thing, which is also interesting to see, is this kind of arms race to higher and higher buildings. And I don't know if that's really the future, but you can see that there is this kind of upward trend in Toronto, where a decade ago, many of the buildings were in the range of 20 to 30 stories, and now we are in the range of 60 stories. Well, I'm not going to show that too long to you, because that's too much. This is, let's say, my observation of Toronto, the condo towers, and this strange paradox of a great city without great architecture.
Holy crap.
Yes.
When do I just, Courage, do I just, this is my condo.
You're getting taller and taller, huh?
Let's see, so hi everyone, my name is David Wex. I'm one of the two partners at Urban Capital. I have discovered why I'm here now. So, you know, it's kind of funny because in my previous life I used to be a lawyer, and I thought, man, I'm tired of everyone hating me. I'm going to become a condo developer. Can you go back to the start? Sorry.
It's not the beginning?
No.
Sorry,
Okay. So I know Hans. Hans was a moderator on another panel that I was on in Toronto a year or so ago. All was good. And I also know this book, and interestingly, I asked Hans recently why we weren't mentioned in the book, because we're a mid-sized, kind of pretty successful Toronto developer, and I was kind of irked when I flipped to the back to read all the developers who were named, and we weren't in there, and he looked at me yesterday when I asked him, he was like, so, kind of a little relieved. I also have one, I did not hear Hans's presentation before, so there's a lot going through my mind. But one thought I have for all you architects out here. We've done a lot of condo units. We've really got them down to a T. And I used to have an experiment. I used to have, whenever there was a row of the same size units, I used to have what were called the architect designs and the regular designs, you know, the kind that is being castigated here. And I tell you, we'd always start, if there were 6 of them, we'd start with 3 stacks of architect designs and 3 stacks of regular designs. As we sold all the regular designs and none of the architect designs, we'd convert 1 stack to, so it'd become 4 and 2, and then become 5 and 1, and then we go, okay, let's just can we leave like 2 floors of the architect design on that 1 stack. So there is, and this isn't really meant to be a defense of condo developers, but there are maybe 10 billion condos in Toronto, and there is some feedback loop. So it would be an interesting, if we had a duel right now, and I had some time to think about it, there's an interesting feedback loop, because a lot of developers do try to introduce other kinds of, and we could talk about instances that have not been accepted in the market for whatever reason. But that's just some recent random thoughts I have in my head. I'm going to talk about this, how to describe a statement that has an inherent contradiction, anyway, design forward condo development. I think that's called, what is that called? Anyway. An oxymoron, yeah. So first I'm going to give those some random thoughts about condo development, positive thoughts. I'm going to talk a little bit about our product and what we design, and then I'm going to respond to what I think the request for in this presentation was how buildings, or how at least I think our buildings, engage and contribute to the surrounding community. And finally, I'm going to give some few, again, random tips on good buildings. So, random thoughts on condo development. Done properly, which of course is not always the time, condo development is part art and really part science. It involves, like in no particular order, typically good business sense, I think a design sensibility, creativity, ability to read legal documents, knowing the right people, often not necessarily, I didn't know any of the right people to start out, understanding construction, you either understand it beforehand or like me, maybe you just learn it along the way, and caring about your customer. It requires luck and perseverance. It combines, very importantly, personal profit with what we're talking about today, public responsibility. And a little rule that I have, it makes sure that everyone is at least 80% happy. And what I mean by this is that when you do a condo project, you do any development, you touch and affect a lot of people. You affect your purchasers, obviously. You've got your investors and your partners, kind of important if you're going to do more of these things. You have the city and the community at large. You also have your own consultants who have made a lot of effort in delivering something and look to you to deliver it for them. And what I think is that if anyone gets an A+, anyone of those groups is really, really super happy, it tends to mean that someone else is really unhappy. So I always aim for like an A- for everyone, and that's how I think you'll see what we've achieved today. So we are a Toronto-based condominium developer. We've done about 7,500 units across the country, all the way from in the east, from here in this city. We'll show you a couple of those. All the way, we're sort of inching our way across the country to the west, kind of like WestJet, a WestJet flight. I think there's 4 key points that define this. One, urban pioneering. We are very big into making a market. We go into markets that have never really had our product or urban condominium product at all, and we try to make that market, typically successfully, not always. Design differentiation. I think Hans's presentation was actually quite helpful, I think, to show you some of our buildings, because we do try to separate ourselves from the main pack, which is a commodity, by and large, in terms of our design. Constant innovation, I think that's something at Credo we try to live by. And also strong branding and identity, which we sell a product. It's more like a widget than really real estate, and so it needs to come with something but it's something that's inherently consistent with what we're selling. I'm going to do this very quickly. It's like a Petra Kucha, I guess, what you're going to have others of all of our products, focusing on some or a number that I think represent what we're talking about and buildings that engage in or give back to the city. So this first one, Camden Lofts. How many people here are from Toronto? Okay, like fewer than Malmo. Come on, you guys, bullshit. Torontonians, raise your arms. Come on. Man, I do not believe that. All right. Anyway, this building, this set it all up for us, and in many ways at Toronto, because this is located in the King Spadina district. It was developed in the 90s when, first of all, you weren't allowed to build residential buildings. This is an employment district, but employment had left because of a number of reasons. We all know. But we built this building before it was approved. We got special dispensation from the city. It took 2 years to sell 40 condos here. It was insane. But this building started out, and it was a precursor, I think, to the whole rejuvenation of the King Spadina that has happened since, turning in one of the best markets, best neighborhoods, most vibrant neighborhoods in the city. Followed by this building a couple of years later, just a block or two away. Interestingly, this building today is surrounded on all sides by 60 or 50-story towers. So if this were a rental building and I owned it, I would take it down and build a 60-story building, but it's owned by, I think, 60 other people. Then after that, we went to Ottawa, and this was actually for my company the big break. We went from 60-unit developments to 420-unit developments. Here's the funny thing. When we did Camden Lofts in Toronto, people were like, hey, it's not New York. No one wants to live in an old industrial district in downtown Toronto. And we went to Ottawa, which was untrue. I mean, it's eventually untrue. Went to Ottawa, and I was like, this is not Toronto. No one wants to live downtown. But the fact is, these buildings all got huge pickup and became great examples of living downtown in a time when that really wasn't happening. Then we went to Montreal. By the way, in Montreal, no one cared. No one really, no one cared whether we'd been in Ottawa or Toronto beforehand. But we did this project, and in the multimedia district, it was the first in that area west of Old Montreal. Again, introducing urban living. And very much at the time, these are 15-year-old buildings, designed forward development. By the way, Camden Lofts and this building, they are not renovations, they're not conversions, they're new build buildings. This is like one of these things is not like the other building. Actually, my partner did this building, so I'm not going to talk about it. This is, he won't hear about this. This was our big move in Toronto, 650 units boutique. It wasn't really boutique, actually, I will admit that. But a huge development down in the entertainment district, just when the entertainment district has started off. By the way, Jennifer, it killed us to get like 10 extra stories, and then a year later, Shangri-La came at like 40 extra stories. But anyway, that was a big move for us. This interesting building, I'm going to come back to this a little later, was our second major development in Ottawa. This consisted of a landowner who wanted to build a multi-story parking lot, and the only way to get the city to do that right in the city center is to build condos on top of it. So condo parking is below grade, then it's 4 levels of public parking, and then a building on top of it. But you'll see later, we really did something beautiful in this building with the parking garage. Another building and a set of buildings, you'll see a few other ones later, in a part of Ottawa that was between the downtown and the Glebe, very derelict. This was a hugely successful project, about 550 new condos and enlivened the whole part of the city, but was the subject of a major, major protest by anti-gentrification people. I was glitter bombed, police, there was a whole big thing. Some other time, I'm sure we won't get into it, but an example of the tensions that come with urban redevelopment. First phase of probably our most well-known project, River City. Does anyone know that? Is that project known by anyone? Anyway, this was our big design breakthrough project. We won an opportunity to build a huge development from Waterfront Toronto through a design competition, Saucier Perrot building. This has won numerous awards and is an example of how design, unlike other design, can be profitable and set quite an agenda. I have a special little comment about this. This is a townhouse project we did. Here's something that bugs me about development in Toronto, maybe other cities. Multi-use developments, where there's a condo tower and townhouse projects, townhouse development right next to it, all part of the same development. Condo tower, sleek, glass building. Townhouses, dorky, faux Victorian or faux Georgian townhouses next to the same development. You can see it when you drive in on the Gardner, Liberty Village. I don't know, I'm sure some of you quiet Torontonians know what I'm talking about. This was the first large-scale modernist townhouse development in Toronto. It was about 50 units, and it really broke the mold. And since then, people have been comfortable to do, you'd have townhouse developments that were maybe 5 units, 7 units that were modern, but no one really committed to do it on a big way. This did that. This is the second phase of River City. River City, by the way, is one, as I was mentioning, lots of awards, but OAA Design of Excellence Award, just won a Lieutenant Governor's Award, probably the first residential development in winning that in possibly ever. City of Toronto Design Awards, this one just, I think, won another one. Also it's won Canada Green Building Council Award. So anyway, enough about that. Another one of my partner's development, I'm going to skip by that one. This is the second and third phases of the Ottawa project I was talking about. This is something I'm going to come back to, our Tableau project. This is very interesting from a public realm point of view. We built the building on basically a huge platform, 5 stories up, so that we can have a public open space below with a 90-foot art piece that pierced the table. Talking about a couple of other projects, talking about making a market. This was in Winnipeg, a very difficult market for a whole bunch of socio-demographic reasons to make a market in their downtown. This was finished a few years ago. You guys, some of you should know this project because it's in, you will admit to that, right? So this is a project we did with the Killam, possibly the reason I was invited here today. Hugely successful, one of my favorite buildings, modest in its scale, but I think the fact that we committed to do something very different from a design point of view, obviously picking up from the adjacent Portlands, but I think one of my favorite buildings we've done. This is the third phase of River City. This is up. It's almost completed. It will look like this. It's a killer building, and I think will redefine architecture in Toronto and give a precedent for really aggressive architecture in Toronto going forward. There's 2 more buildings I want to talk a little bit about. This was our micro condo project. And I show this because this is funny. This is a building actually made with red glass, so I wish when I saw Hans's color chart up there, I was like, man, I wish I'd put a photo of this one, of the building itself. But this was a building on Queen Street with red balconies. It looks very sharp. But what's interesting about this is that we had a whole problem, economic problem with making this project work. We had to make super small units, and we embraced the super smallness. The whole campaign was about like pugs and Napoleon and stuff like that, about how great small is. But I'll tell you what made this thing work, because it was super expensive to sell. This dishwasher. You see that little dishwasher over there? You pull it out from the... People would come into our sales office and go, oh man, I love this dishwasher. I got to buy this condo. And I kid you not, that dishwasher saved this project. So everything in this kitchen, this is a 10-foot kitchen with everything you need in your apartment. This is a project we're doing. This is our current project. If any of you guys are looking for a condo in the city, this is a great one right over here, going up not far from here. One of our most recent new markets, Saskatoon, where we knocked it out of the park. We did really, really well. And then last phase of River City, I'll come back to in a little. And then this is a massive development we're doing in Mississauga. So all the point being that we really are, I think it's one of our credos is going to new markets, being designed forward and constantly innovating. So how do buildings engage and contribute? First, as I've been talking about, making a market, catalyzing urban redevelopment. So as you can see, Camden Lofts in Toronto, East Market in Ottawa, River City, Glasshouse, Southport, they've all done that. They've all, I believe, set the trend or made a new market. Design. Obviously, design is a very important way to engage. So each of these buildings, I think, do it in slightly different ways, but I think they make a statement. Obviously, here I'm talking, in this slide, I'm talking a little bit more about how you are at grade and inside your building itself. So your lobbies, your amenity spaces. One of the things we've tried to do now in locations where retail isn't going to work is to put the amenity at the ground level to create some kind of animation at the street. More than just the gym, but to really incorporate the public spaces so there's a street presence. And here's just I don't know why this is here. This is our interiors. Support the streetscape. The last thing is to support the streetscape and the community. So I'll spend just a moment on these slides, maybe longer. The top slide is a rendering of our fourth phase of River City. And what's interesting about this is behind River City Phase 4, called Harris Square, is one of the most spectacular new spaces in Toronto called Underpass Park. Does that resonate with anyone? Underpass Park is a park that Waterfront Toronto built under the overpasses, the Richard Mandalay overpasses, and it's a spectacular place. Very urban, gritty. In front of this is another park by Waterfront Toronto called Harris Square, very elegant French-style public plaza. And our building was going to sit right between these two spaces, basically cutting them off and making each really much less than the two together. So we lifted our building up for about maybe 50% of the floor plate, lifted it up 5 meters and connected to two spaces. So that's, to me, a way in which a building can contribute to, or at least not interrupt some majorly important and highly invested public spaces. Bottom left is our Tableau project, which I mentioned before. Interestingly, this transfer slab, it basically sits 5 stories up in the air and holds up 30 stories above it, as there's an open space below. A smaller case, this is a snapshot from our rendering, which our building will look like this, of Goresbrook Park on a very residential street, trying to create intimate residential townhouses to suit the neighborhood. Here is the image of the parking garage I told you about. It's beautiful in that city. Below it is a more typical design, but what that sort of shows is the importance of generous, high-floored, retail, glazed, to create a nice ambience on the street. And the last one I want to mention is this thing on the right, because this is part of our River City development, but this is a case of just a nice architectural move. Not many people walk down here, but each one of these townhouses has a private porte cochere made of smoked glass, and I think it really adds something beautiful to walk down that street. So some last tips on designing good buildings. First, really hard, but leave enough time. I really believe that good design doesn't necessarily take more money, it just takes more time and effort. Design for one idea or message. And what that means that is I often have architects who say they want to throw everything into a building. It's like, this is a great idea, this is a great idea. And I'm always like, you know, we'll do another building together. Like, let's just do one simple theme. So that's, I think, something that I think is very important for good design. Don't overreach, design well to fit your budget. One of the failings of buildings I find is that they try to do something they can't afford. And I think it's just better to not do it all. Marshal your money that you have and do whatever it is. It can be simple, but it's better to not do a design feature than to make it out of a really inexpensive material. Treat the architect-developer relationship as a partnership. So I think, you know, it's basically respect your architect because you're in it together. And one thing I've noticed sometimes when we have other partners, they'll say things like, we can't afford to tell the architect to take it out, or tell the architect to do this. I'm usually the guy who's sent to do it when we have partners. And what I usually say is, you know, better to tell the architect what the problem is, give him or her the budget, and let them figure it out. So those are just some of the tips I have for the ways in which design, you can work together to bring good design. Last thing I want to talk about is, this is our Goresburg Park project. We bought it zoned, so I didn't have to fight with the local community. And this on the left is before, and on the right, you can see it pretty well the same form after. My point is, and this is about how important is a developer to the process. It's the same architect, it's a different developer, and interestingly, it's the same budget. We had both budgeted. And I think that's a real telltale about the importance of a good architect-developer relationship. Thank you.
So it's me again. Sorry?
You don't need the presentation.
I do need the presentation, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Something completely different, at least in terms of scale. Malmö is not Toronto. And also from a different perspective, I want to talk partly from the municipality's perspective. How do we achieve what we want, if we can? And a few examples of architecture from Malmö that we think is doing what it should do. What you said to the streetscape. What's the word? To make a good streetscape, to contribute to the streetscape. I will start with some reflections on what is Malmö. There are similarities to Halifax, although it looks completely different. What I see the similarities is in the complexity of the streetscape with the old buildings near new ones, high buildings near small ones, different materials, different styles. I won't go back to the medieval times, but what you can see in Malmö is different layers of history and or within the same street, reflecting the ups and downs of the history of the city. And I guess that is also what you see actually in Halifax. What we like to have, and then that's what I'm coming back to, is to continue work with these contrasts between old and new, and the variety, so we don't fall into the pictures that we saw from Toronto recently, from Hans. By the way, I would say we don't have a strong heritage advocate group in Malmö. For some reason, that doesn't really exist. The strongest advocates are actually within the municipality for preserving the heritage buildings. First of all, a little bit then about our legal system and what we have, what the tools we have from the municipality. Myself, I'm working with comprehensive planning, and that's not legally binding, so it's just guidelines, but that's actually important, because when we come down to those plans that are legally binding, that's actually saying the yes or no that we talked about before, and it's a lot of no, but using the policy documents, it comes down to early dialogues, shared visions, shared interests, to find common goals together, and what we say, working with value planning, you can call it, trying together with the different stakeholders, different developers and architects, and or the involved developers and architects, preferably the inhabitants, if they are there. We are not as good as that, as I told before. A lot to do with the different departments, of course, within the municipality, to try to find the qualities that we have in that place, and what do we want to add. How can we find that as a basis for the process. And then again, of course, it comes down to, in the end, negotiations, as we talked about, as Jen talked about before. So it's the same, I think, but on a different scale. What we are doing currently is one of these policy documents. It's actually a thematic addition to the comprehensive plan as a tool for this discussion. And it's in Swedish, so I didn't bring many copies. It states 9 theses about architecture. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's on different levels: the city, the space, the urban space, and the building itself. Talking about how the architecture can add value to the whole community. How the architecture can strengthen the identity of the city and the character of the city, how the architecture can contribute to the long-term sustainability, both environmentally, socially, and economically, how the architecture can contribute to the streetscape and the life in the street, how it's formed in relation to its context. You hear it's like kind of mainstream in a way, but it's good to have it to go through when you have these dialogues. How the architecture can change over time, how it can be inviting and accessible, how it can give us a sense to stimulate all our senses, and how it can age with dignity. So we think it's not actually, this is going to be approved by the city council, and then we can sort of use it as a discussion or bang it in the head of the developer or the architect. So just some examples, and then we will be back to the housing exhibition of 2001, when the municipality really, you can say, started the process of trying to engage developers and architects in early dialogue. This was a special moment because it was a housing exhibition, so we could ask more. We asked the developers to choose architects that had either won some prize or had been published in international magazines. A little bit stupid kind of choice, but still. And the developers, and especially the architects of Malmö, were really upset with that. And as you can see, it was a plan that was completely different from what we had done before in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where there were small lots. One developer could get 3 different lots in the area, and we asked them to have 3 different architects. And it came out with this sort of variety that actually is a lot of the character of Malmö. And what I forgot to mention in this last speech, of course, here also talking about the waterfront, is the microclimate, to not do high rises, but to have a low rise but quite dense, with a twisted plan that takes down the wind. Anyway, so the continuation of the Western Harbour, we learned lessons from this housing exhibition. Sustainability, environmental sustainability was the theme of the exhibition, and we continue to work with that. A lot about water management and energy. How do you say plus energy? We have some plus energy buildings now. And continue to work with different lots, or many different lots within the same block, working with early dialogue between all the developers. We invite, the land is owned by the municipality, so we invite developers to bid, and maybe then we have 10 developers within the block, and they started competing with each other, and actually raises the ambition higher often than we have expected in the beginning. and we try to work with smaller developers rather than the big ones, because they are easier to negotiate with, obviously. So some other completely different projects, but if the point of the developments where we try to divide into smaller lots, of course, is to make an interesting streetscape, to make the urban space interesting and inviting. But that can also be made in other ways, like in the convention center designed by the same architects as the building we are in. It's a concert hall, is the red one, the yellow one is the convention center, and then it's a hotel, the white higher buildings. And what this building creates is a very nice urban space along the canal, where you meet the people that are not going to a convention meets the people that has some kind of Doctors' Congress or something. The interesting with interior space is that you can actually walk through it any time of day, as it's always open to the public. And even though the concert hall is managed by the municipality and the rest is managed by the company that is running the hotel and the Congress Center, but in the agreement of the whole thing from the beginning was that it was going to be one open indoor urban space where you don't have to go shopping. And here are some pictures. It's really, you can see some similar ideas of this building where the different spaces sort of intertwined together. Next to it is Malmö University, also Danish architects. We have Swedish architects also, but we tend to be a lot of Danish architects in working with big buildings or major buildings in Malmö. And this is a little bit the same, actually, where the indoors is created. It's a public space. You can go there and study, or there is a public restaurant. The problem is that the students say that, yeah, there comes people there that they're not supposed to be here, so we have no space to study, because it becomes a popular space, and it sort of also floats out in the streets outside. So again, we think it's a quite successful building in terms of how it relates to its context. Then we have the Museum of Modern Art, the Malmö branch, which is an extension to an old electrical plant. Again, working with the contrast of old and new, creating a landmark in the old part of the city center, and I think a very interesting interaction between old and new. Scale-wise, it's same, but in its language, something completely different. And also, again, working with the transparency and with the simple modes, creating an interesting urban space outside that can be used for exhibitions and other stuff. Swedish architects, by the way. Really, two really young guys, and actually one of them is the son of the planner of the housing exhibition. Then this one is also a son. It's a son of Göran Utzon, you know, the architect behind the Sydney Opera House. This is not one of my favorite buildings, to be honest, but it has the quality. What did you call that in Amsterdam? The white. What did you say it was? Overstated? Yeah, exactly. This is the same here. Although I like it because it has the quality of either you hate it or you love it, and that's also a quality of architecture, I would say, that it actually makes people sort of interact with it in an emotional way, and also it's a great collision, I think, between the old and the new, and again something that is very much Malmö. And finally, talking about scale, the Mouse House. It was just there one day, a few inches high, in a busy pedestrian, in a busy street, and nobody knows who put it there. The municipality didn't take it away, which again would have happened if it was in the 60s. So what does it tell us? Well, it tells us, I think, about some kind of mentality in the city, some kind of creativity that hopefully reflects also in the other kind of developments we do. So now it's gone, unfortunately, probably taken away by the guys who did it. So I finished there. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Vincent Vandenberg. I'm an architect and partner with two other gentlemen from Breakhouse here in Halifax. We are a multidisciplinary design office. We are a human-centered retail, hospitality, community, and cultural design company. So it's a bit of a mouthful. So what I'll do, and it'd probably be the best way to explain a bit more of what we do, I'll just take you through one example of a client and work that we did. These are three gentlemen that came into our office, and this is how most of our projects start, with the people that are connected to the businesses that we're working with. They were engineers that wanted to change their career. I don't blame them, they were engineers. And no offense to the engineers that are there. They wanted to open up a brewery. So they had already started a little bit of work, and these three goofy, funny, intelligent engineers that didn't take anything seriously but beer had this name, Wrought Iron. It was a very aggressive craft brewery name that sits in the middle of all the other craft breweries, and it didn't give them anything to stand on. It didn't give them anything to speak of and stand out above the crowd. So after getting to know them and talking to them a fair bit, we came up with this idea that they should be a little bit more human and a little bit more robotic, and we came up with Good Robot. We wanted to call them Drunk Robot, but we knew that there's some, complications with looking at abusing alcohol. So anyway, from this point of the brand positioning, we were able then to use that to articulate everything within the space. So that then formed the language on the inside of the building, it formed the language on the outside of the building, it becomes a part of their communication strategy and their marketing moving forward. And they've really adopted it, and it has been something that they've really enjoyed working with. And this is not in isolation to any of the other work that we do. This is the way that we approach everything on all scales, from smaller spaces all the way up to urban planning. What is it like for the people who are going to be in it? What's it like for the people that are using it? So the question around the conference then of art, the art of city building, has the primary question of what is the Halifax that we want to be? And the way that we would approach it is to change that question slightly. What is the human experience that will make our city great? So for us, it means a little bit more than the architecture and the planning. In all honesty, as much as I would like to think that architecture is really important, it is actually not really that important to a lot of the city. What really makes a city is everything that's around it, all the other aspects of the built environment, what's in the buildings, the people that are using the buildings, the life that exists within that. And so what can we do as designers to support that human life? And we believe as an office that if you can put the human experience first before any of the design solutions that you generate, we will collectively move towards a greater city. So this diagram here could be a way to approach designing our city. In the center we have the human experience, and then surrounding that are the variety of disciplines that go to creating the built environment. This is actually also our business structure. We have all of the silos that we perform within our office and we do for all of our clients. And then at the center of it is the human experience that we always design for. So if we are going to be designing all of these different layers that go towards making a great space, a business, or a city, we always have to be designing everything better. So our philosophy and the way that we approach all of our work is the belief system that design does make everything better. So I believe that we were asked to speak here today because of the many layers of work that we've done within our city, within Halifax, and some of the work that we have coming down the pipe. Everything from architecture to urban planning that we're doing over in Dartmouth, branding of this particular building, temporary structures, an Argyle Street pilot project, retail spaces, and a great deal of our work which is in the restaurant and hospitality field. And I think one of the reasons why the restaurants are a big piece of the work that we do is because a lot of our clients understand that there is not a separation between a brand and the built space that you design. Everything needs to be connected and cohesive. You can't break apart the different pieces of the design, otherwise the experience is then disjointed. And I think actually for the conversation that we're having today as the panel and for the streetscape portion of the discussion, it's important to recognize how critically vital restaurants and urban spaces are to our urban fabric. If you look at the success that some of the restaurants that we've done have had to some of the streets, like Edna, for example, which was one of the first restaurants on Gottingen Street, it showed the success to a lot of the other businesses that would soon follow and recognize that there was fertile ground that they could use. We're recently starting some work. I see some of my clients in the room here, so I got to tell the truth, I guess. We're doing some work to the brewery market, taking an existing building and bringing it back to life. It's a building that is very much loved within the city because of its history of being the home of the original Keith's Brewery, but also because it was the home of the original farmers market. The problem is it's completely disconnected experience. Everything from signage, people get lost, the built spaces. There's a great deal of confusion when anybody goes into the space. If you've ever seen anybody as a tourist walk in through the front door, they scratch their head and then they quickly turn and leave and go back out onto the street. So, but there's also the charm that comes with that complexity within the space too. A lot of people have always described their love of the old market because of the sense of adventure that came with it. So we wanted to do what we could to keep a lot of the existing qualities, but also bring apart a sense of clarity to the new space, or to the existing spaces, sorry. So the first thing we did was come up with a program strategy and then the wayfinding signage. We rebranded the space and came up with a very simple structure and room naming system, which will make it a lot easier for people to move through the building. Things as simple as lighting, for wayfinding strategy to mark and designate areas as public. So again, you don't need to spend a great deal of money to make some significant changes to the space, and then all of a sudden when somebody walks into the rooms, they can see that there is a purpose behind it. Something as simple as putting in chairs. It doesn't need to be complex, but it's all of a sudden understood as this is a place for you to sit. And then immediately next door to that, we have started working with the existing farmers market that is there. And we will be working with them to create a new strategy and a new brand to bring that back to life. Around the perimeter of the building, we have addressed each of the entrance points to create a cohesive language between all of the areas to start to pull together all of the disconnected parts. So this front entrance, which is by the lower Water Street, is now, you can kind of see it in the far back on the left, on the right, sorry. There's a little entrance door which is tucked in behind the parking lot and behind some trees. We will be opening that up with a new entranceway, a new public space off of the front, which will be used through all times of the day and in through the evenings and in the shoulder seasons as well. And we've carried that all the way out to the front of the building to mark it as a neighborhood. It's a bit of a district. It's not just a piece of a building that is separated from others, but it is actually connected to its adjacent building, which is the Alexander. So the Alexander would then adopt the signage strategy and the streetscape design that we've done through the market. And this is what, it brings me to another part of the conversation that I was asked to speak about, which is about marketing positioning for some of the buildings. When we were asked to look at doing some marketing and branding for the Alexander, what you typically find and where it started was a building first, meaning the building as a commodity is pushed forward. So it's really hard to distinguish one building from the next. As we were saying earlier, a lot of the lobbies look identical, a lot of the room finishes look the same, so it's hard to distinguish one from the next. The advantage in this particular scenario is because we've done some work with the market, we had a human experience that we could put forward. That human spirit experience would then be a part of the Alexander. The Alexander could use this building as part of its amenity space. And there's a nice tension that starts to exist between the old and the new Alexander and the piece of the history of the brewery market. What old is new again. So Mr. Alexander Keiths and the Alexander could have a relationship with one another. So meet the voice for the Alexander. So it becomes a nice, approachable, strategic voice for the building to describe what it is that the building stands for, what it's offering within the neighborhood and within the community of the Alexander itself, and the brewery market. This begins to define the Alexander as being stitched within the neighborhood, Halifax's original neighborhood. And it's a great vehicle for describing what it is that the building has to offer. Another project that we worked on was the Argyle Prototype. It was an interesting exercise as a pilot project, because it was an introduction to what was going to be happening and is currently happening now to Argyle Street. The animation to the street was started with this temporary exercise, and which goes to show that you don't need to do a great deal to a street to transform it into something that is exciting and public. It was a graphic exercise along the sidewalk, and we were part of a team that worked with a lot of the landscaping around the edges and the temporary planters. So we, of course, have our very famous planner on the side showing his approval. One other project here is Scotia Square. And I think the piece that I find interesting about the work that we did here is an approach of looking at our existing urban fabric as something that can be repaired at times. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to redo everything. We don't need to tear it down and build something new again to make it better. So we could reintroduce the Scotia Square to the city by looking at what was existing, and maybe there's something within it that is positive to move forward, that could support the human experience. So we looked at it from a city scale. How could it be introduced new in the skyline? What is it on the top that could give it a new life? And then along the streetscape, at the lower level, there are some existing canopies that we could use to our advantage. So with a degree of optimism, we were able to reintroduce this building to the city. Glazed transparency within the corner, to address the street, to show the activity within the inside, and then a new top to give it a new definition amongst its neighbors from the city scale. And ignoring the entire body of the building because it's not necessarily going to be influencing the human streetscape. And then from the inside looking out. So the very last project I want to take you through is King's Wharf. This is yet another waterfront development. But I think what would be interesting for us as a conversation is that it is very much close to home. We were asked 2 years ago, actually, to put forward a proposal for a building which is noted as E and F. You can see it as the big block on the top left. And we had trouble with this approach of just putting the proposal forward because we didn't understand the overall vision for the development. We didn't know how our new building, if we were to get the job, would really support and engage a larger sense of community within the neighboring buildings, because we didn't know what to expect. We met with the developer. I see him over there in the corner. You looking from height? So we approached him and said that there's some serious problems with the development. What we see here when we look at all the public space around the buildings is a series of disconnected public areas that have no purpose and buildings that are supposed to be iconic to stand for the meaning of the development. What we're getting is a series of towers in the park, an exercise in urban planning that we found to be a little unsuccessful in the 60s, a dangerous space. And what we were seeing were some environments along the street that weren't supportive of that human experience that we were hoping for. And then the word iconic. A word that is used a great deal but does nothing for a community. It does not draw, I believe, tenants within the building. People don't want to live in iconic, they want to live within the neighborhood. They want to live within the community. So we started to look at what we have within our neighborhoods, within HRM, that support the kind of lifestyle that we're looking for. We looked at the Hydrostone, and we looked overseas to our Scandinavian friends at some of the examples that were out there that we could learn from that had the right sense of proportion and scale and lifestyle. We talked a great deal about diversity. We wanted to have a place where we could imagine that somebody would move into with their very first apartment. And a great community would be one that you could then raise your first child if you had one, or then move into another place within the same development when you are in your later years or if you're a senior. So the degree of diversity should be reflected within the development. So the last few images that I have here is the illustration of where we got the original development. This was the state of the DA when we got it. We took the 1,500 units that were planned for the development. We broke them up so the streetscape was articulated into smaller buildings. We articulated the streets. We moved them over a little bit so we can create a green space in the middle of the development, an urban center. We pushed some buildings off of the side so that we could actually create double-sided streets with buildings on both sides, so we can create rooms. We then created a series of parks that wrap around and stitch together all of the buildings. Spaces and parks with purpose and meaning. We created a retail environment on the streets that was connected to other buildings. They weren't spread apart as missing teeth. They were all very much connected, so you can have a continuous loop and a continuous retail experience throughout. We provided places for public art. And then we ended up defining areas as districts. So the architecture would fall suit within the districts that we've established and the parks that we've created. So the architecture is the last thing to fall into place. We're not designing the buildings to influence the parks. We're designing the parks and the places for people to live that is going to be supported by the architecture. So from the outside, looking at it from the harbor, we see the small, lower scale surroundings of the townhouses. As we move through and up closer, this is the walkway that would go around the entire development. A series of different townhouses. We don't see this as something that's done by one architect or one hand. There would be a great number of architects that would be involved to give it a sense of time and uniqueness in building to building. And then we have parks. This is a green space that's right in the center of what we would have had as our urban development, right off of the water, like our urban core. And then this is the most intense urban center. This is the commons that sits right in the middle of the development. It has a green space, it has a community kitchen, it has public gardens or community gardens, and it has a Lido water space that people can touch the water or come close to the water. And then on the far opposite side, this is closer to the Dartmouth side, we would have the largest retail space. The sidewalks are really large that would offer a lot of space for tables to spill out. We'd have the 3-lane roads. There's one that would be a temporary parking so that cars actually in some cases are not always the enemy. If you have a vehicle, you can actually come up closer to a great number of retail spaces as opposed to always walking in our frigid climates in the middle of February where the wind can rip your face off. You want to actually be in a vehicle so you can get close to your place. So this would help a lot of businesses. And then from the Dartmouth side, looking back at the buildings, we have a very intimate cove and space that respects the existing Dartmouth space, lower in scale, and then human in focus. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, David, Tyke, and Vincent. If you could join us up here for some panel questions. I'll just be asking a few questions of the panelists, and then I'll open up the floor to any questions that you may have for these gentlemen. Tyke, I'll start with you. How can city planners draw on the experience of developers, practicing planners, architects, and landscape architects to enhance city building regulations and future city growth?
Okay. I think I got the question. Well, first of all, I think there's a lot to learn, mutual learning, I would say. As we have heard, I mean, it's the relation between the planners from the municipality and the architects and the developers has to do a lot with negotiation. And of course, the first thing is to respect each other's expertise. To understand what we sometimes talk about within the municipality is that everybody's actually right, but nobody has the full answer. And then, of course, if you want to be more concrete, I think I don't know how it is in Canada, but planners in Sweden don't really know so much about economy.
That's more than they know in Canada.
Sorry, that's more than they know in Canada. Okay, to be a little bit frank, maybe not really, a little bit mean is to say that planners within municipalities sometimes are quite naive about what can be actually achieved from the developer's point of view, or even from the architect's point of view. So, and that's nothing. It's quite self-evident, maybe, but I think that part is the main thing. Without saying that economy should be the sort of designing factor completely.
Great, thank you very much. Vincent, you answered a lot of the questions that I had for you, so I'd like to ask you a different question, if that's okay. Aside from safety and accessibility concerns, what are the elements that all buildings should respect within the context of the city fabric?
Well, I guess, in part, some of the pieces that I was talking about, all buildings need to address the human quality that is existing within it. One of the, maybe a really good example, and the challenges that I'm sure that some pieces that David would experience as challenging, laying out a particular unit within a building is often starting from the basement, the ground floor, or the parking garage. So the entire layout of a unit, the living space, is actually governed by cars and parking. So there's always this struggle and tension between what is necessary within parking and other human qualities and spaces, but also what is driving a lot of the decisions that we're making. So I think that so long as you're designing a space like a unit, and it's got complicated grid lines because of an awkward layout of a parking garage, so long as you don't have a column that's sitting in front of a window between you and a television, right? As long as you're thinking, as long as you're thinking about what it's actually like to live in the spaces that you're designing, I think then we can always know that we're moving towards a better design and a better place.
Excellent, thank you. David, how can the owner, contractor, and design team collaborate to ensure good design that works within the budgetary and schedule constraints of urban developments?
I have no idea, Abigail. I have not.
I was hoping you'd help me out here.
I have no friggin' idea. Yeah, seriously. Well, one of the things I guess I do is I do give our budget to our architects at the start, so that they can't say later. Because sometimes architects, I don't know the budget, blah, blah, blah. So we do give the budget, and we do give allowances for things. For a while, we were doing what's called integrated design, IDP, integrated design process, which means everyone who's involved in the design of the project has to go to every meeting and sit through every meeting. You need a super big boardroom. lots of lunch and coffee. And then, you know, that's supposed to make sure that everyone's views are taken into account. And then it was really tedious, and everyone's on their iPhones and stuff like that. So then we went away from doing that. Until recently, we discovered that we missed a whole major part of our green requirements because we hadn't had our sustainability consultant come in to a meeting for about a year. So, you know, frankly, it's up to the developer. It's up to the developer to make sure everyone's there, and I do think that everyone needs to buy into the budget as much as possible, so our construction managers are always there right at the start. And it's a totally iterative process, and then you go for tender, and you know, you cross your fingers and you hope it's going to be okay.
Great, thank you very much. Hans, what do you feel is the role of what we call starchitecture in city buildings?
Well, I think it's interesting what you said about nobody wants to live in an icon. I think there is a certain misunderstanding that an iconic building, well, you can tell them maybe about your Calatrava behind all the nice housing you've shown. There's a misunderstanding that it will suddenly change magically the whole neighborhood into something that it wasn't before. I was at a lecture recently where a Gothic design was shown made by Andrea Palladio for a church in Bologna. And it turned out that it was an unfinished church, and there was an interest of the city architect to keep this project going on forever because he was on the payroll. So as long as it would take to finish the building, he was secure. It turned out they asked Palladio and Giulio Romano and Peruzzi and I think a fourth architect, and they were asked, mind you, 16th century, to come up with a design how to finish the facade of a Gothic church in Bologna. And they were happy to provide a Gothic design because it turned out they were offered the equivalent of 2 years' salary for their design. So there was already back then a kind of the use or abuse of, let's say, star architects to make a proposal even if they knew it was only for the sake of the discussion. And I think if it's for the sake of discussion, it's fine, but if it's there eternally, it's maybe not always a great idea.
I have.
Sure, Vincent, go ahead.
You know, I think there's a role for the Starchitecture buildings. I'll come back to one of ours that's quasi that way. But this summer I was in London, and you know, every new building, every new office building down in the city is a Starchitecture building. And I kind of hated it. I didn't like it at all. I didn't think it hung together well. Everyone is kind of showing off to the other one. So in a way, the boring architecture of downtown Toronto with all those buildings was at least a more holistically hanging together experience than what I saw in London. So I think there's a role for both. I just want to come back to the point about no one wants to live in an iconic building. Our third phase of River City, our Société Perrot building, is very iconic. It's probably, when it's about to be done, and it'll be up there, if not the most iconic recent building in the city, it will be one of them. And for sure, everyone, those units are in many ways very problematic in order to achieve the exterior architecture. I would hate for Hans to get his hands on them, but there are some that are 1,200 square feet with 8.5-foot ceilings and a balcony, and then there's one on top of it that's 300 square feet with a 800 square foot balcony that has a 10-foot ceiling. You know, and but people, that thing sold out immediately, mostly to architects, and there is a role. Seriously. So I just think there's a role for that, but not every building. If you could make it happen, many of our buildings are meant to be background buildings because that's what the city needs.
Yeah.
Before Vincent comments, can I ask one more question, David, about the project that you're speaking of? Do you find that the sell-out rate of that building has more to do with the neighborhood that you've developed or the building itself?
Well, I think early on it was the buildings and the promise of the buildings. Now the neighborhood has come into its own, not just because of us, but other developments that have happened near there. So it's a mixture, and also, I mean, the biggest thing is the market, right? In Toronto right now, you could sell a lot, right? But there was a premium that we received because of the architecture. You can't decouple it from the extra cost. I don't know the answer to that.
Great, thank you, Vincent.
I think one of the biggest things that I was trying to get across with regards to the iconic building is that there is a kind of, like in some of the renderings that you were showing, each of the buildings had this expression of this life-changing moment, like this sort of the scene in Blade Runner where this building is just this miraculous thing that's going to save a neighborhood. But the other side of that is that you can get to an iconic building by actually doing it right all the way along. And it becomes iconic just because it's so good. It's like saying, I want to be the best hockey player around, but without necessarily knowing that you have to work your butt off to become that. So to say that you want that means that you have to work all the way through. And a lot of times I think there's a misunderstanding of how hard it is to be iconic, and therefore there's a misunderstanding that it just means it's a pretty picture. Right? And then the last thing is, I really do agree with what you're saying, that there is a real need for a lot of buildings to be background. You know, if you ever walked through an expo, like a World Expo, every single building is full on and full tilt. It's like loud band playing next to loud band, and there's no connection between the two. So if every single developer or architect were to approach a project as wanting to be iconic, you would end up with the most disastrous city you could ever imagine. So there's a need for, like Vegas, yeah, for sure. So, well, Vegas is good for something. Yeah, so, okay, yeah. But you know, like some of the color schemes that you were talking about, Hans, where it showed a sort of neutrality. You know, if you looked at the palette that would exist in Paris, for example, the streets of Paris, I'm sure that you would find a lot of similar hues, right? So there has to be a discussion still between both, always fundamentally coming to it has to be done well and done right and designed properly.
Tyke, would you like to add to that question?
Yes, no, I agree with everything. And your reference to the Turning Torso is interesting because it's an iconic building by some star architects. And I don't think it adds very much to anything, and the flats are really crap, and it doesn't work economically because there's very little floor space to a huge core of so. But the people in Malmö loves it because it is iconic. They maybe don't want to live. Well, yes, I think many people want to live there, but more just because it is iconic. Then they can't afford it, so it's another issue. But as you say, I mean, a city with only buildings from star architects that come and do their thing, often it looks similar to. I think what the problem with some, not all, but some star architects is that the context is quite uninteresting for them. They do their thing, and again, they sometimes, not all of them, but some they do shout a lot. And that doesn't become a nice streetscape.
There's a comment for Bud. Keith wants to make comments a little bit.
Well, I'll just make a comment in that same thing because I think it's a very important conversation because there's this is actually a common conversation in Toronto around the bland glass towers as opposed to having more interesting building typologies. And the tension that I think needs to be managed in city building is that you actually want a pretty similar color palette. You don't want the streetscape to be screaming at you. If you think of the great cities of the world, whether it be Paris or Barcelona, or if you think of London, which was used as an example here, many of the buildings that were built in London are mid-rise buildings that were made out of brown brick with Georgian windows. In the 18th century, it's actually a pretty boring building typology if you take your time to actually look at the buildings. What makes the city interesting is the layers that Vincent was talking about. The people, the places, the green infrastructure is how you start to define the character of a city. I think the risk is when we talk about having a whole series of buildings that kind of shout, and I would agree with you entirely, David, that the worst buildings in London are the loud buildings that have been built in the past decade. They're the worst buildings, and they don't have any kind of public realm at all. They kind of scream out of the landscape of the city. when you have too many buildings that are too loud, that don't have any kind of unifying typology, you get the experience of Dubai. Google Dubai, look at Dubai's skyline. Do not go visit Dubai. It's because you have to drive everywhere, because Dubai was all about loud buildings. It's not about places, it's about being in your car. It is actually the counterpoint to what we're considering to be kind of a boring city. And the last comment I'll make is just with respect to your presentation, Hans, because I think there was something a little dishonest in it, and I have to call it out, which is you showed all these fancy renderings, and of course, those are marketing materials, right? A developer is trying to sell a project, so the lights are on and it's a sunny day. We know that that's not the real world. The lights sometimes go off, the trees aren't always mature, and it's not always a sunny day. But then at the end of your presentation, you did exactly the same thing, and you showed an absolutely ridiculous graphic of buildings you can never build in Toronto. We have a 25-meter separation distance between towers. The vast majority of the city is designated for mid-rise, not for towers. And then you took kind of a skewed picture of a streetscape to make it look like it was a sea of towers. So I think I have to call that out. You're going to have to fix the presentation, because you're actually showing something that Toronto isn't becoming and that it will never become. And do we have mistakes in the landscape of our city? Of course we do. We absolutely do. But that isn't even remotely what's being built today or what the vision of the city is. So I do think it's a completely unfair and dishonest thing to show.
No, I'm happy that the nightmare won't become reality then. I think this discussion about the colors of Paris, the colors of London is interesting. I think we all agree that there is an arms race of iconic buildings which lead to some sort of law of diminishing returns. They have less and less effect. But if you speak about the consistency and homogeneity of Paris and the colors of Paris, I think there is a difference there. There is a level of sophistication in the, let's say, the average boulevard, which I don't think has been achieved in Toronto, for instance. So you can say that the color palette might be grayish green, greenish gray, but it's not as, so there's somehow it's not enough background, it seems to me. Many of those condo towers, they still want to stand out, many of them, but they don't have the right, let's say, vocabulary in that. So it's not really background, it's not really foreground, it's somewhere in between. And well, David, you mentioned that you were not included in the book, which is, I think it's clear that most of your projects are, let's say, in a different league and trying to achieve different things than the average run-of-the-mill condo tower. So that's maybe an explanation. And I'm not sure if your third phase of River City is indeed iconic. I wouldn't define it like that.
I want to talk, I mean, this could be a moment where we could actually duke it out. Like, first of all, housing in Toronto, those condos that you took a photo of, and that's Concord 8X, we know what that is, the same thing in Vancouver. They're serving a purpose. Housing in Toronto, that high-rise housing is basically middle class, or basically middle class housing, and what's going on right now. It is a commodity, by and large. So like in anything, in clothing, in cars, and you've got like the bottom 30%, which is total crap. You have then 50 or 60%, which is just good, you know, like just regular good stuff. Then you have the top, whatever's left, 20%, which is super good. So the thing about that you rail against is I don't even think it's not the real crap, because a lot of that real crap is not happening anymore. But it's the middle stuff. And like I was in New York, that sounds like I'm traveling that much, but you know, you look around, a lot of the stuff is just crap there, or just regular stuff. A lot of the new stuff is regular stuff. It's, we have so much going on in Toronto, and it's so much window wall, which is now getting, that's a whole other story. But I really do believe that you're picking on the bulk of the stuff. It's like saying, you know, most people wear clothes from the Gap. And yeah, most people wear clothes from the Gap. And most people live in decent housing that provides you an ability to live in the city center at an affordable price that's well built because of our Tarion, everyone, this bugbear about, or this upcoming, oh, all the condos are going to leak. I personally think that's total bullshit because of all the controls that the government and the Tarion system puts on you. So I think there's room for great stuff. There is great stuff going on in Toronto. There's some great buildings, many of them built out of window wall, and there's some crap, like Aura, for example, total crap, but it's just that middle of the road stuff. And I just think that you're reacting to the fact that there's just so much of it happening in such a small place.
Great, thank you very much, Tyke,
Oh,
Hans,
sorry.
David,
Oh,
and
God.
Vincent.
I thought you were
I'd
coming
like to
next.
open up the floor now for some questions from the crowd. Okay, we'll go right here in the middle.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the organizers for making this free and open to the public. But my question is largely, I guess, kind of influenced by Jennifer's words today when she said that we need to plan for the future.
What?
And also,
Plan for the future.
Is that cities are always evolving and they're changing, that we don't always know what the future is going to look like. And I've realized that a lot of this conversation is kind of revolving around aesthetics and market forces. And I'm wondering how we can ensure that our future cities are built practically and resiliently, and what we can do as planners or policymakers or engineers or architects or even citizens to ensure that our cities can be able to accommodate a changing future. How can we make this process a little bit more cyclical, and so that we know that whatever happens in 20 or 50 years from now, that what we build now will be able to maintain that and withstand that. And maybe moving the conversation a little bit more away from what buildings look like and how they all look similar to like how can we actually ensure that we can still live here in the future.
Well, unfortunately, I got the microphone. Yeah. It's a great question, and you know, I think the best thing for me to do is draw on the experience that I had working on King's Wharf, where off of the water's edge we had conversations of rising sea levels. We had a lot of conversations about how to provide space for vehicles. What's going to happen in the future when vehicles likely get smaller, when we're not going to be maybe depending on as many vehicles. So there were a lot of questions asked in a number of different consultations that we had with other people outside of the team, such as yourself, that were raising issues that were critical. And there is, unfortunately, from what we've come to find, is that there is no ability to predict all things, right? There's no one answer that we could find when we were doing the work to say, this is going to be amazing in 60 years. Like, I wish I had that kind of foresight. However, the way that we approached it was similar to the conversation earlier about New York. You know, there is a need for some quality of life that exists today as they did 40 years ago, as they probably will in the future, which is a sense of dignity and space. That people have the ability to have a place that they can share, have a sense of community. People will always need some of these basic human things. So if you can provide spaces within a design so that, you know, maybe condos are not just 300 meters squared, or, no, that's still big, 30 meters squared, sorry. It'd be nice to have a 300 square meter place in Toronto, yeah. But to have something where you have the ability to live with a family and have the basic needs met. And those are not complicated problems to solve. It's just looking at it through the lens of what we've needed before and likely what we will need in the future.
Great, thank you. Andy, you had a question?
I just want to say, in terms of planning for the future, I think it's almost impossible. We planned a building about 2 years ago to be ready for the entire garage being electric cars. And by the way, that over doubles the amount of electric capacity you need. Over doubles, so in the building. It's insane. But we made all this planning for it so that in the future the Condo Corporation could act in a way to upgrade their electrical. And then, like last year, it comes up, there's all this new technology, it doesn't really need that anymore. You know, all that you got to do is to have a certain amount of, I can't remember the word, it's a mechanical term where there's just not this, anyway, it evens out the requirement and you don't really need double the thing. So, you know, all that work from 2 years ago got overruled by some work from last year. And now, I don't know what to do. We ask this question all the time. So, anyway.
No, and I think one important aspect of your question is that ideas about the city actually change a lot. You can say there are certain constants, I believe that, but there's a lot of change. If you look back, I'm an historian, so if you look back at what was written in the 1980s about cities, people were pretty convinced that this, let's say, postmodern approach to urban planning was the answer for all the errors and mistakes made by modernists, and modernists did the same prior to that. So there's always this kind of repetition of the belief that you know it all, which is, I think, an argument to be careful and cautious, which is, I think, in the Canadian nature, so that's possible, and to make steps which are, let's say, creating gradual, incremental change and not necessarily a total makeover.
Tyke, would you like to comment on the question?
I think this gentleman summed it up excellent. Actually, I don't have anything to add.
Andy, did you want to ask a question, please?
Sure. This is yeah. We all live in northern climate. We all live in winter cities. Malmo, Amsterdam, Toronto, Halifax are all winter cities, and yet I didn't see one bit of any presentation that addressed that. We can't go to these waterfronts in the wintertime. They're not habitable. I'd be more interested in talking about connected buildings than iconic buildings. Buildings that talk to each other and provide a winter environment that you can enjoy. Winter gardens, spaces on the waterfront that you can use in the wintertime. It's really important, and yet I haven't seen one photograph that started to address it.
Tyke, I think maybe that's something that you could speak to.
Yeah, I don't agree. If you come to the waterfront of our housing exhibition area, Bodenled, you will find a lot of people there, even in the winter. Of course, doing other things than in the summer, and there is not too many places indoors because it's mainly housing. Of course, we have to think of uses that takes it. But I think we actually do, and also for example the way that the layout of the plan there creates spaces that is actually bearable also during winter. I mean, we also have examples in the 1980s in Sweden, at least. I don't know the rest of the world, but where we did a lot of indoor glazed spaces that is sadly empty even in wintertime. So it doesn't. I mean, it's not. That's not the solution, obviously.
Go ahead.
I think one of the challenges with Halifax, I have to say, is our relationship with the off seasons as well. When I was living in Austria and I was working there for a little while, they had winter markets. The weather wasn't any different. There wasn't anything within the built environment. It didn't look a great deal different in some spaces like the Grand Pré that we have. It's just a matter of how we want to use it and be outdoors as well. So, to your point with regards to designing for it, there's, in the work that we were doing with King's Wharf, we had low-rise, we had microclimates, we were always opening up to the south end, or the southwesterly end. We had large streetscapes which could be sheltered from heavy winds, and also, and fundamentally, I do believe that if we change a little bit, I think as Haligonians, to say that winter isn't horrible, that we can actually do things in the winter. There used to be winter book markets and stuff that for some reason have just stopped. And there are a lot of places in the world, like in Scandinavia, where they have the same weather that is considered to be bad, but it's also something that they look forward to. So it's not just a built solution, I think.
Great. Thank you very much to the panelists and to the organizing committee for this project. It's been amazing. Let's give a round of applause to everybody. Great, and we hope to see most of you at Garrison Brewery tonight at 5:30 for the closing reception and Pechakucha night. Did I say that right?
Cheap beer.
Oh, and cheap beer, so I'll be there.